Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much to the organizers for the invitation to this prestigious university. I'm very glad to be presenting a recent report which I've authored, and I hear that we have just 3 copies of the report just arrived on time, so they should be sitting there, so feel free to grab one for yourself and your loved ones at home, of course. Well, there are 2 things which really excite me about the SDGs. One is that for the first time, the world has come together with stakeholders as different as they are across the 193 UN member states to unite on a set of common values, of a common denominator, if you like. It might be a small common denominator, but nonetheless, 70 goals which are universally applied to countries around the globe. And the second thing is that this old relationship that we used to have in the last centuries of a few rich countries as teachers showing the world how it's done, and the pupils in the poor south of the globe trying to become like those, that old relationship is no longer fit for the future. That's been put to an end with the SDGs, because now, at least in my view, all countries are now developing countries when it comes to truly sustainable development. We all still have a long way to go to reach that ambitious goal. And in order to kick off a process of peer learning, this study was published in September this year. It was published with 2 motivations in mind. One was realizing that many mainstream policymakers and commentators in OECD high-income countries still looked at the SDGs as the somewhat continuation of the MDGs and therefore a development agenda which doesn't really concern us in the rich world as much as the poor world. To really shake them up and raise awareness that the SDGs are as much about the way we in the rich countries live and consume and produce as they are about the developing regions of this world. And the second motivation, beyond raising awareness, was to provide a blueprint for what the learning process over the next 15 years can look like. I mean, obviously we already have a number of initiatives and they were highlighted eloquently here earlier. But I think we need to top it up a notch over the next 15 years and make them more successful and more to the point, so that the next 15 years really make efforts towards reaching the SDGs. Because as it currently stands, and that is one of the main findings of the report, as it currently stands, the high-income countries of this world are on track to fail the Sustainable Development Goals. And I'm going to go into more detail about how I come to that conclusion in a second. But first of all, I think no one says it more eloquently than one of the most admirable statesmen alive today, and one of the fathers, in fact, of the Millennium Development Goals, if not the driving force, Kofi Annan, who says in the foreword of the study that it hopefully will spark reform debates about A, sustainability, and B, social justice in high-income countries of this world, because these are 2 issues that we in the high-income countries still have a lot to catch up on. And I think we can be as confident as saying that his wish has somewhat come true, because awareness, I think, has been raised. We launched the study 2 weeks ahead of the UN summit, when the world wasn't really talking about it, at least not in mainstream media. You know, we obviously have a big refugee crisis which is dominating the discourse and which is somewhat linked, of course, to this agenda, but the SDGs weren't really taking center stage of the newspapers which we read on a daily basis. Few people, of course, the experts knew that they're coming, but I think mainstream policymakers and the general public wasn't really aware that we're only 2 weeks away from the biggest summit in history. But I think to some extent we did our little contribution to changing that atmosphere, and there were reports in over 40 countries, mainly focusing on the position that countries have in the ranking that we produce. So we compiled the first SDG index of Sustainable Development Goals indicators, and we're talking about the methodology in a second, But it clearly shows that there are some countries that are more prepared and more ready for the goals than other countries. For instance, the US trading all of the latter places, and also Australia, especially on climate change, doing very badly. And now, as history, a coincidence of history was that a few days after we released the study and news reporting in Australia was very bad for the Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, he had to resign, which doesn't mean we toppled him, but it's certainly a funny coincidence that a week later, also because he was criticized for his climate change politics, he was very much criticized for that. But the main gist of the study is that there are some countries that are more prepared than others, and these countries are mainly Scandinavian countries, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Finland, Switzerland at number 5, Germany number 6, and a number of countries such as the US on rank number 29 aren't so prepared for these new goals. And there are basically a certain number of key challenges which I will try to highlight in the 20 minutes which I have. I won't be able to go through all the 4,500 data points we analysed, but I'll hopefully be able to give you a glimpse of what's in the study, which of course you're welcome to take along. So we teamed up, so I authored the study with a small research team at the Bertelsmann Foundation, but we teamed up with a formidable network of institutions around the world called the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and I'm glad Maria has taken the stage later on as well, in order to select snapshot indicators for the Sustainable Development Goals. 2 snapshot indicators which fulfill a number of criteria: feasibility, suitability, and relevance with regard to the Sustainable Development Goals. So feasibility means that we need indicators that are already there, which we can work with, and which are of good quality for all those unique countries. Suitability means we need indicators which sum up a lot of what the goal is about. Obviously, these goals are very large and often multifaceted, so we try to come up with a couple of headline indicators, which, if you apply methods of data reduction, would then summarize a lot of the evidence summarized in that goal. And relevance. Many of you will be aware that there is an official process happening in New York. The UN is working with the interagency and expert group on a full monitoring set of SDG indicators, and that's going to be finalized in March next year, probably composed of hundreds of indicators. And we were striving for a large overlap with what they're working on. Of course, the list isn't final, but it was one of the considerations that we had in selecting our indicators. And there are two underlying challenges for all high-income countries. As I said, I won't be able to go into detail of all the findings that we have in all the countries, but I think 2 underlying challenges pretty much summarize why, in their current state, OECD countries are on track to fail and they must take immediate action to go the other way. One is inequality. Our economic systems are basically designed to exacerbate the trend towards more inequality, and not the opposite. We used to believe it trickled down a couple of years ago, so that the wealth trickles down. Well, history has shown it doesn't. And 23 OECD countries now have a Palmer ratio, that is the ratio of the top 10% and the bottom 40% in income, where they are, the top 10 earn at least as much as the bottom 40%, 23 OECD countries. And 30 years ago, the ratio between the top and the bottom 10% was 7 to 1. Now it is 9 to 1. And you see that gap is increasing, and that's because our economic systems exacerbate this trend. For example, a country like the US has a poverty rate of 17.4%, and that clearly shows that the wealth isn't shared as inclusively as it should be. Now, this is not to say that we shouldn't focus all our efforts on extreme poverty first. Of course, even if I'll be talking about the high-income countries now, that's because the awareness there has to be raised, it's about us. But it's not about taking away any attention from extreme poverty. That has to remain the key focus. But nonetheless, I think with all our wealth that we have in the developed world, so-called developed world, we must find ways to make this wealth more inclusive. I promised two key challenges. One was inequality, and the second is our overuse of resources. A number of goals relate to how we deal with the resources that we have on our planet. And it's noticeable that half of all OECD nations still draw less than 11% of their energy from renewables. And lots of OECD countries produce in the area of 500 kilogram waste per capita. In the US and Denmark, it's even over 700 kilogram of waste. And this overuse of resources clearly has to be tackled going forward. Now, there are three types of goals which can be identified in the 17 SDGs as far as rich countries are concerned. One group of goals refers to domestic sustainability, and that's what I've been talking about so far. So how do we deal with our own structures in the economy and society in terms of sustainability? The second group of goals are do no harm goals. They relate to policy coherence. So if we want to have a coherent approach, it means that we cannot do one thing in one goal and then do the opposite in another area. For example, think about agriculture. If you spend official development assistance on fostering the agricultural sector in Africa, but at the same time you've got subsidies in the agricultural sector in Europe, which have an impact on global pricing, then clearly that's not a coherent approach. And the third area of goals in the new 17 SDGs relates to global responsibility, such as official development assistance. And there it is remarkable that of all the countries that we looked at, only 5 countries reached the goal of devoting 0.7% of their official development assistance to developing countries. These countries are Sweden, Luxembourg, Norway, Denmark, and the UK. Many countries fall short. Germany, for instance, is only at 0.4, although Chancellor Merkel went to New York to the summit promising it's going to be more in the next couple of years. But Spain, for example, reduced their ODA by minus 62% over the last years relative to GDP. Now, I've talked about problems a lot, but let's also look at solutions, because in the report we go into a lot of detail in trying to highlight. Don't worry, you're not supposed to be able to read this. This is just an illustration of how we went about. So you see lots of red dots, green dots, yellow dots. What we did in this study was to look at all 17 goals in 34 indicators across all the 34 countries in the OECD. And we tried to identify best practices. What are already areas in what countries that can serve as role models for the others? How can we stimulate more peer learning in a systematic manner in order to achieve the SDGs? And Sweden is a very good example of how an economy can at the same time be a strong economy with a high rate of employment, a high GDP, and at the same time have a socially balanced policy framework with access to healthcare, access to education that is widely spread in the population. And thirdly, that is low carbon and friendly to the environment. And there are, of course, ways how you can get there. Sweden had taken certain measures to get there. It was, of course, rooted in public awareness for these issues in the Swedish public, but also introducing a carbon tax helped to set the right financial incentives in order to let such industrial sectors grow which are less energy intensive with regard to, as opposed to energy intensive industries which have grown less strongly in Sweden in the last couple of years. So there are concrete policy instruments which you can apply, and now the peer learning process in the next 15 years has to be, what can be other examples? There are, of course, a number of areas. When you look at the 17 goals, we've had a nice slide in the morning. We've had a nice slide in the morning where you've got these icons, these very good images. And there are areas across the 17 SDGs where OECD countries are pretty much all doing well and playing in a similar league. For example, public safety and peace. All OECD countries are more or less safe places to live. The homicide rate varies between 0.2 to 4.3 per 100,000 people, with of course Mexico being a dramatic exception. But there are areas, and we call this the Great Divide in the study, where OECD countries lie far apart and where we still can learn a lot from each other. For example, education, socioeconomic background almost determines your performance in school and your success in life, basically. In France, New Zealand, and sadly also here in Austria. Whereas other countries, such as Estonia, Iceland, and Norway, manage to promote an equal level playing field for students in life. And that's just one example. And we have got strength and weakness profiles in the study, which show you at a glance of, across all these 70 goals, where countries are already doing well and could serve perhaps as a role model, looking at their policies and how they got there. And then, what are the red dots? What are the areas where they need to improve the most? And there are also some counterintuitive findings, by the way. Gender equality as measured by the proportion of female representatives in parliament, or as the gender pay gap, is in a better state in Mexico, according to these indicators, at least than in Germany, for example. Now, a final note on sustainability and sustainable lifestyles, because I used to do, and I still do, a lot of research and reading in the economics of happiness. And there is a growing literature of, what makes people happy and how you can measure that. And there are surveys running, knocking on people's doors, asking them to rate their life satisfaction. And sustainability always seemed a bit going against that. So I think the common perception of a sustainable lifestyle among many people, I don't know about you, but I think among many people is that a sustainable lifestyle, a truly sustainable lifestyle, is one where you have to forsake a lot of things which are part of your daily routine and which you consider fun. So a sustainable lifestyle is one where you have to forsake many things and therefore be detrimental to life satisfaction. So we ran a correlation, and actually it turns out that the countries which do very well on the SDGs in terms of a sustainable society are also the ones where people themselves report to be the most satisfied with their lives, and therefore, demystifying this potential relationship there and showing that actually it's a positive relationship between those two concepts. And we've touched upon, and this should be my final remark, we've touched upon the issue of ambition in the goals. And of course, there are, they are very ambitious. And for any country to reach 17 goals in 17 diverse areas is going to be very, very challenging. But I think we can be ambitious, and we have to be ambitious. Because if you look at the experience from the Millennium Development Goals, we should just take inspiration from what developing countries try to actually manage to achieve. So for instance, developing countries managed to halve child mortality over the last 15 years. Of course with the help of development assistance, but nonetheless that's a tremendous achievement that we should take a pause of reflection and think, if they managed to halve child mortality over 15 years with the MDGs, well with the SDGs, surely the rich countries should use that framework, put it center stage in policy making, and that's the challenge we're discussing today, how we can make that happen, because that's the crucial link. And then in the next 15 years, start a peer learning process to come up with our equivalent of halving child mortality in the rich countries. Thank you.